This room deals with traditional weddings. Here a procession. I've seen some of that being replicated. The reception lasted a long time, and the neighbors used to poke holes in the paper covering sliding doors. The more holes that they had punched, the more the people were proud of that particular wedding. And I bet you, in contrast, they could also illustrate that they were not pleased by not poking it at all. It has become simple and apparently pragmatic here in Japan now. Once was used, as it was in many cultures, to cement the relationship between families, and therefore it was very complicated and very important. The house apparently was built in the early 18th century, or 19th century, excuse me, 1800 somewhere, and was in the merchant style, although it alleges this man was actually a very wealthy farmer. There's a little water wheel, and I think we'll find that it's operating a machine inside here to pound grain. And it runs off of water brought down here in a wood or log aqueduct, spilling lots and lots of water, but water's cheap here. Well, it's kind of fun to see this actually working. Sounds like it's working, but I don't think it is. No, it's not working. It would actually, because it's coming up, it would lift up one of those things, and then as it got past this thing here, it would drop down, and that kept doing that. And notice that they're alternating sides. Right now it's just going round and round. I don't recall whether this was invented by the Chinese or in an Arab country. Simple structure is what it looks like, a storage building for shingles, which had to be replaced every 3 to 4 years due to the damage from water and so forth. And they replaced the ones that were bad, keeping the ones that were new, still keeping the ones that were still usable. And they were principally made from chestnut, but it took considerable skill because manipulating the cut relative to the grain was the critical skill. The Tankas House. These look like a bunch of sandals that never got used. Underneath here, and probably here, are cellars, kind of like what we call the root cellars. The scene of a farm village in Hida. It's always amazing, isn't it, how man survives in his world, given whatever the conditions are he encounters. Fortunately, of course, he doesn't know what the future holds, so he can't be envious of it, and probably doesn't know that much about how the wealthy live, and he can't be envious of that, and it's not his place. And it furthers him not a strong mat knitting screen. I remember, I think it was in Thailand, Mae Salong, watching a lady make weavings by the side of the road. Interesting, what looks so rustic to us was so state-of-the-art and more than fulfilling for them. They had all these things, then their life was good. They were used for beating the straw to make it soft. So it points out that in the winter time, when the snows got so deep and the cold so great, that you camped out around here at night, and probably during the day, and made sandals, pounded straw to make it soft and pliable for those sandals as well as these straw mats, and did other kinds of things that you could do in the wintertime indoors. These indentations that we see on the surface here are the product of this adze. So all of this was planed by hand in that manner. I've seen it done, and they're very good at what they do. I'd bugger this thing up pretty badly. The straw would have been put on this rock and then beaten continually with this thing until it was soft and pliable. Original context of this house before it was moved. Encased in stone and some rock chunks. And here we have, well, that's an interesting tale. Or is it not a pail? No, it's not. These two alternate back and forth, filling with water. Now, that's a clever way to do it. Just like interesting large stones, apparently the remains of trees that are interesting are kept and preserved. Some of the carvings of a priest named Enku from 1632 who made a resolution to carve about 120,000 statues. So all over Japan he carved somewhat simplistic statues. This shed is the hasagoya, used for drying grains. When hours of sunlight were short between winter and fall. The inside was also a workplace, and the upper floor was the storage area for straw and farming tools. And just imagine the time it took to carve these out, not to mention the amount of work that each of them did. This is interesting as a grain pounder, because what was this end where you'd normally stand? Here, you see that design. Seen items like this in the United States and elsewhere, but for what purpose I don't know. There for cutting sheaves. I've seen the same device for cutting tobacco. Look at how elaborate the design on the end of this one is. So not so terribly old. And the tiller. May look simple, and it is, but it did what great back-breaking work by a husband and wife team if they had an ox or a horse that could drag this through. And here's one of those devices I've seen, which I think are for rice paddies. And this one here probably for the same thing, but a different function. Gosh, you have to wonder what this elaborate piece of equipment was for with all the metal gearings. Looks like it held spools of something there. Here a mallet has a refinement on the pestle. This is the Nishioka's house, the middle 1800s. Typical Gaso Sukura construction that I'll see in Shirakawa. I've seen two of these boards with mallets, but I don't know what they're for. It's probably the well room. Clever enough to build your building right over a well, so it's all contained within the dwelling. And carrying those two barrels filled with water on your shoulder with just that digging into it. Very large koi noburi. Call it a kite, call it a flag, whatever you like. Represents the father. This was its original surroundings. This is interesting because this house has this intermediate floor. It's so low that even the Japanese know that they have to protect people, because dumbasses like me will run into it even if they do see a sign there. Baskets used for carrying mulberry leaves. Here another elaborate device for cutting off the lengths of things. Like much until you think of the difficulty of doing it simply by hand with a knife. To those people it would have saved great agonies. Same thing with these devices here. Chopping the mulberry leaves into smaller pieces. You can see how they chopped around a radius there. And notice how it's been chopped down, of course, since they were right-handed. These trays were used for moving the silkworms, maybe as I saw them doing at the textile center. And the worms are apparently very sensitive to temperature. So if the temperature is too low, they won't eat, and their growth is slow, and they can become ill. Best time is spring and autumn. So these heaters were necessary. So the worms apparently have a tendency to migrate upwards. So they would take, after the worms had been in a tray for a while working on some food and getting bigger, they would put a new net on there and put new food on that new net right over the top of the worms and the old net, and let the worms migrate up to the new level of food, etc., 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 as they grew bigger and bigger. And apparently paper was placed on these trays to keep the worms from falling through. That's probably working with the individual worms. These trays here were placed on this rack when they were worked on. So these were the racks, either there or straw, or they're more precisely made, on which the worms were induced to build their cocoons of silk. There you can see several of them bundled up. Apparently, some of these devices that the worms grow on can only be used once. They won't go into them or use them twice. So this machine is important for the mass processing of the straw that makes whichever mat we're looking at. In the racks on which the worms would be growing and on which they would then install their cocoons. Similar kinds of egg crates, racks if you will, that we saw at the center. So the cocoons were placed in those baskets, and then after that, for some reason, they were placed in hot water as part of the process. That outer layer that the worms create for some reason has to be removed before they can get access to the silk. And these are various devices for winding the silk onto something for then making thread, I guess. But notice that there's levels of automation back in there. That configuration for making rice, why it's relevant. Sakichi in Tosin's book is described as making sandals, and here's how he would have done that. All over the world, people learn to use their feet as well as their hands and their teeth to do a great deal of work. Arigatou gozaimasu. Different examples of the straw maker's craft. A little bit more, and these are like little devices for probably carrying a sake bottle, maybe. Maybe these are a little bit better booties, better sandals, boots for snow. So when the silkworms first go on those egg crate devices, they create their own little fan of that gauzy material, and then after that they begin to make their cocoon. Apparently down in here are the eggs. We can't get that tight. Adult moths, pupae. There are 2 or 3 of those large troughs that we saw in one room that looked like a kitchen. Inside of a watermill for making bracken starch. Don't know what that is. This is a model of the building we're in, and apparently these large troughs were part of that process. These are doing some pounding that we'll see in a moment mechanically by the water wheel. And then these were erected at the place where they were digging the rhizomes of the bracken starch, because they had to change places every year, because you had to wait for 7 to 8 years after you harvest the rhizome from one spot. So they just moved the entire factory to the next place each year. Imagine the people who beat themselves to death on this rock with those tools. The arthritis they had in their elbows. Here you're digging the rhizomes of bracken somehow. Processing them using those large tubs of fune. Another part of the process. And then the drying. So on the other one, what it'll do, I'll see that slot there doesn't have its wood in place, but if it did, as it moves forward, it would lift this thing upward. It's very heavy. And then it would drop it. And the next one would lift and drop, etc., etc. So you had 3 of these things and 4 drops for each one through a rotation of that axle. You see the rhizome, the bracken material inside there that's being pounded. Imagine the amount of work and hard labor that replaced. Men harvesting it from the ground. These woodcuts illustrating the process. Pounding, I think that's a hammer she's using. Yep, that's a hammer she's using. The washing of it. Now why it stops, I don't know. This answers the question we had earlier. Those scoops take on water. When they get sufficient water and they're at 8 pounds plus per gallon, then that's enough pounds for those scoops to tip downward as a lever, and then that causes the other end to rise and then drop down and smash whatever it is it's trying to grind. But look at how clever it is to use one stick to fill both of them. There we go. Another similar mechanism. What it's supposed to do, I don't know. Water dumps into that reservoir, then overflows enough to fill up this bamboo, which then rotates. I think it's just illustrating the principle of the water can be used as a motive power for the lever. Innovation of an axle and wheels to our sledge.